Thanks for having this conversation with me today, Paul. I'm Dr. Victoria Mattingly here with Dr. Paul Spradley of Care-Based Leadership, and we're just going to chat a little bit about, what I've been seeing a lot in the societal narrative, but also with our clients around how do we have conversations about sensitive topics, particularly race and Black Lives Matter at work. So Paul, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. And I'm also curious, have you been getting similar questions and requests about how to have these conversations in your work as well?
I have, and I think one of the things that's been interesting is how people have been coming into the conversations. I think there's a lot of really well-meaning senior leadership, and they're trying to have different conversations, and so, or they've written a statement, and it may not fully represent the voice of Black and Brown people that are in the community, and so it has at least started a conversation, a dialogue internally, where people are saying, well, we appreciate that you put this statement out, but it was missing this, or maybe you said this and it wasn't the right way to say that. So it's at the very least started a conversation. And one of the things that I've been hearing a lot is that, for a lot of Black Americans in workspaces, they've not felt heard, both presently and then leading up into this point. And so that's one thing that we're trying to address. I don't know if you've heard similar things just about not being heard, or what does that look like to be heard?
Absolutely. And that's a huge theme I'm seeing, and not only like in media and in recounts of what's going on right now in companies, but also among my clients. And I feel like there's two ways to go about this, and one way is just reaching out to those and having those conversations, especially if you're in the role as a leader. And what's been interesting though is there's one line of thought where reaching out's a good thing and checking in's a good thing, but there's another line of thought that it's just adding more undue emotional labor and burden on those who are already burdened in the workplace for a variety of systemic reasons. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this idea of, reaching? I know I had reached out to you just a few weeks ago as everything was going down with George Floyd, and I did come from a place of genuine wanting to check in and wanting to just be a good, colleague and friend and partner in that regard. But I'm curious, what are you seeing in regard to like the reaching out both interpersonally, but also in a more, assessment based or, organizational level of the reaching out?
Yeah, so great question. So I think interpersonally, it could go in a couple different ways. I think there are Black Americans who'd be happy to respond, but I also think that white Americans should understand that if this is your first time reaching out, and there's been lots of other traumatic events that have happened that I'm wearing the weight of, that it might seem disingenuous if this is your first time reaching out. Now, if this is your first time, but you also plan to reach out again, because unfortunately, this is the kind of thing that's continuing to happen still in our society. So when something else happens, if you reach out again, then you're developing a pattern of being consistent with reaching out to me. And I'm much more likely, because you've established a relationship with me. But it's also okay for Black Americans to say, I don't really feel like talking, and have this belief that I haven't seen you here before, right? Like, you haven't had this conversation with me before. So what's changed, and not really understand where you're at as an ally, using your language and terminology, until you've demonstrated that work to me, right? And so I think from a corporate perspective, they need to, organizations need to have conversations with their Black and Brown employees. There's one organization that I was working with, they only had one Black employee. And if that one person doesn't want to speak, it's also okay for them to get information in other places, right? Like if that one employee doesn't want to speak on behalf of the entire Black culture, which is at that point, that one employee, that's fine. And an organization shouldn't make a person be the voice piece, right, for a culture. That's, like you had mentioned earlier, it's a heavy weight that people don't need to wear, but it is valuable to assess. So assessment is something that you do. So how would you collect voices from people in an anonymous way?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I jump into that, I did want to have one quick follow-up point with what you just said. Something I talk a lot about in how I talk about allyship and being an ally is the concept of consent. and leading these conversations off with giving that person that opportunity to opt out, and waiting to have the conversation until you gain that consent from that individual. So, in the case of the client example you just shared, like, did that person have that opportunity for consent to opt out? How was that framed, and how can we be aware of, this person might not want to go there, and that's completely fine, and giving them that space to say no. So consent, I feel like, is a really important way to start those conversations, and gaining it, and continuing to get it as those conversations continue. But to answer your question about assessment, so really looking at what's the sentiment going on in the organization right now. How are people feeling about whether they're being heard, whether their voices matter? Do they feel like that their company is really investing in diversity in a meaningful and strategic way, and not just treating this as a retroactive, Band-Aid to cover things up? And the way I recommend doing that is through a variety of methods. So a large organization collecting survey data, and bringing in an expert or a consultancy that knows the right questions to ask, the questions that really lead to engagement, that lead to turnover intentions, that lead to the things that companies care about, and mapping on not only how do people feel about diversity, do they feel like they belong, but also how is that impacting how they see themselves in the company. For smaller companies, assessment can work, but the smaller the pools you get, especially if you only have one Black employee, like the example you shared, we couldn't say, oh, and here's what the Black community thinks of this company, right? So there's interviews, there's focus groups, there's other ways to pull out that data. But I think the most important thing is making sure that whatever that assessment protocol looks like, that you're getting at the intersectionality of different voices. So you're measuring, women, race, caregiving status, even sexual orientation, things and then you can also slice the data in certain ways to see what are differences between groups. I think that can be a really powerful way to analyze the data as well. If you can look at an overall score of how much people at this company feel like they belong, but it's a lot more interesting when you look at how that belongingness score varies across different groups.
Yeah, I love everything that you just said, and the only thing that I would add is that as in that space of what does it mean to be an empathetic listener? So once you start to hear some of these things, whether it's showing up in surveys or focus groups, how are you listening? Are you sort of jumping in and saying, no, that's not how you feel. That can't be how, right? Like, or are you listening to what the people are saying? So I think that those are fantastic ways for people to begin thinking about how to listen to their employees of color, particularly now, given the civil and social unrest that's happening in the world.
Yeah, listening is so important. And then this is another conversation for another day, but then actually taking what you hear, really understanding it, and then doing something with that information afterwards, as it makes sense. But another conversation for another day. All right, Paul. Well, thank you for chatting today about this. I look forward to continuing this conversation. And please share below any comments or feedback you have, successes or challenges you face with really getting to hear important voices, especially whenever there's so much going on right now that hearing these voices matter now more than ever in the workplace and in society at large.